What happens when you blend the valor of a war hero with the horrors of a child murderer? Allow me to introduce you to Gilles de Rais, a man whose extraordinary life spans the heroic and the grotesque. In one breath, he stood alongside Joan of Arc as she crowned a king. In the next, he descended into the depths of unspeakable depravity, spending the following decade engaged in the systematic torture and murder of innocent children within the dark confines of his castle dungeons. We are talking about a figure who metamorphosed from a national hero into one of history's most infamous serial killers in less than 20 years. This tale is not a Hollywood fabrication. It is a chilling narrative that describes how the golden boy of medieval France morphed into its darkest nightmare. A story so twisted that even today historians are divided over whether he was a monster or merely the victim of an elaborate medieval conspiracy. By the end of this account, you will gain insight into how power, isolation, and unchecked desire can corrupt the most virtuous of souls, transforming a once-admired knight into something altogether satanic. And believe me, the reality is far more disturbing than any fictional horror you might encounter in films. Born in 1405, Gilles de Rais had life handed to him on a silver platter. Coming from a prominent family that owned vast estates in Brittany and Anjou, he was among the wealthiest men in France by the time he reached his teenage years. When his parents passed away, young Gilles inherited a treasure trove that would make modern billionaires green with envy. However, mere wealth did not satisfy young Gilles. He craved glory. At the age of 16, he plunged himself into the tumult of the 100 Years' War, exuding the zeal of someone who had never set foot on a true battlefield. Remarkably, he excelled, garnering attention for his military prowess as he achieved a string of victories against the English. Then came the pivotal year of 1429, which transformed everything. A peasant girl named Joan of Arc claimed divine guidance in her mission to crown Charles VII as king. While many nobles dismissed her, Gilles saw something extraordinary in her vision. Consequently, he devoted his considerable wealth and military expertise to her cause. What transpired next was nothing short of miraculous. Gilles fought valiantly alongside Joan in some of the most crucial battles of the war. He was present during the lifting of the siege of Orléans, marched alongside her to Reims, and stood beside her as Charles VII was finally crowned king. By the age of 24, Gilles was celebrated as one of the most esteemed knights in France. He was wealthy, valiant, loyal, and revered, even earning the esteemed title of Marshal of France from the Church, the highest military accolade achievable at the time. Gilles de Rais was living the medieval dream, but dreams can quickly devolve into nightmares. In 1430, Joan of Arc was captured by the English, and by the following year, she had been executed by fire. Joan's death marked a profound turning point for Gilles. The man who once charged into battle with fervor now receded from public life, retreating to his grand estates like a wounded beast. His subsequent actions would have made any financial advisor weep. Gilles began to spend his fortune extravagantly as though he believed the end of the world was imminent. We are talking about lavish theatrical productions that cost more than most kingdoms' annual budgets, complete with elaborate sets, costumes, and hired actors. He hosted banquets that lasted for days, serving extravagant feasts to hundreds of guests, many of whom likely thought he had lost his sanity. However, perhaps the gravest shock lay in his sudden preoccupation with alchemy and the occult. Gilles essayed books on black magic and enlisted the help of self-proclaimed sorcerers and alchemists who promised to aid him in transmuting base metals into gold. Not that he needed the money, given his immense wealth, but rather as a futile attempt to fill the gaping void left by Joan's demise. Rumors circulated among his servants regarding bizarre rituals conducted in the castle's lower chambers, while locals reported odd lights and unsettling sounds emanating from his properties at night. Where once he had fought for God, he now appeared to be courting the devil. Then, children began to vanish from the villages surrounding his estates. Initially, the disappearances involved only one or two children, typically the offspring of impoverished families who were eager to send their kids to work at the castle, hoping for steady wages and a better chance at life. Tragically, these children never returned home. When concerned parents inquired about their missing children, Gilles' servants offered vague reassurances about the kids being sent elsewhere for greater opportunities. Intimidated by Gilles' wealth and status, local authorities turned a blind eye. Who would dare challenge one of France's most lauded war heroes over the loss of a few peasant children? Yet, the disappearances were not random. They followed a disturbing pattern. Young boys between the ages of 8 and 12, often possessing fair hair and delicate features, were targeted. It seems that these children reminded him of someone from his past, perhaps even of himself. The hero of France had become a predator, and his hunting grounds expanded with each passing day. Within the confines of Gilles de Rais's castle, events unfolded that were nothing short of horrific, surpassing the darkest imaginings of fiction. Gilles devised a sinister technique for enticing his victims. He dispatched his servants to nearby villages with promises of employment, education, or an opportunity to join the castle choir. Desperate parents seeking a brighter future for their children unwittingly trusted their sons to the Marshal of France. Once inside the castle, these innocent children were thrust into a nightmarish reality. The abuse and torment they endured was methodical. Gilles did not merely extinguish their lives, he relished in prolonging their suffering. Witness accounts describe his chillingly meticulous preparations for these vile acts, treating them with a monster's formality. He forced the children to participate in mock religious rituals before subjecting them to protracted periods of unspeakable cruelty. One of the earliest documented instances involves 12-year-old Judon, an apprentice to a furrier who was lured in under false pretenses. Upon his disappearance, his family was misled into believing he had merely found work elsewhere. In reality, Judon became one of Gilles' earliest victims. Testimonies from his own servants unveiled a disturbing routine. Victims were initially treated with kindness, receiving fine clothes and sumptuous meals before being led into secluded chambers where Gilles revealed his macabre intentions, deriving pleasure from their fear. Etienne Cororo, a servant known as Poitou, recounted how Gilles would restrain the children, stifling their cries, before committing unspeakable acts against them. The methods employed for their killings varied: decapitation, throat slashing, dismemberment, or merciless blows. A particular double-edged sword, a braquemard, was designated for these gruesome purposes. In his disturbing confessions, Gilles openly admitted to inappropriate interactions with the corpses, expressing a morbid fascination with kissing the bodies and admiring the severed heads and limbs of those he found especially attractive. He even engaged in dissections, sometimes while the victim was still alive, taking pleasure in witnessing their final agonies. Reports from his accomplices indicate that Gilles maintained some bodies for days, solemnly indulging in grim rituals associated with them. The castle furnaces served as a primary mechanism for disposing of the remnants of his heinous acts, obliterating any possible evidence of his atrocities. Conservative estimates suggest that he claimed the lives of around 80 children, with more expansive calculations indicating the number could have exceeded 200. This reign of horror lasted nearly a decade, with Gilles' depravity intensifying over time. Disturbingly, Gilles claimed that these heinous acts were part of occult practices. He believed the blood of innocent children possessed transformative power for his alchemical experiments and could summon forces to restore his wealth and resurrect Joan of Arc. Thus, medieval France witnessed the emergence of its first recorded serial killer operating under the facade of a war hero's reputation. By 1440, however, Gilles de Rais made a fateful miscalculation. His extravagant spending had drained his considerable wealth, and he began to irritate influential individuals. Desperate to sustain his extravagant lifestyle, Gilles resorted to selling off family lands and borrowing heavily from the church. When his creditors came calling, he responded with violence, kidnapping a priest attempting to collect on church property and holding him for ransom, blatantly violating ecclesiastical law. This marked the final straw. The church and local nobles, who had previously chosen to ignore the troubling whispers surrounding the missing children, suddenly had the legal grounds to take action against France's most inconvenient war hero. The ensuing trial of 1440 resembled a medieval media spectacle. Gilles faced numerous charges including heresy, sodomy, and murder in both ecclesiastical and civil courts. The prosecution showcased a stream of witnesses, including his own servants, local parents, and even some lucky children who had escaped from the grasp of his castle. However, this is where the narrative becomes complex. Some modern historians argue that Gilles de Rais was in fact a victim of a grand medieval setup. Consider the facts. He was immensely wealthy, politically influential, and held damaging information about half the French nobility from his military exploits. His creditors included powerful bishops and nobles who stood to gain possession of his lands should he be convicted. The timing of his arrest, thrust upon him at the height of his financial turmoil, appears suspiciously coordinated. The confession that sealed his fate came only after he faced threats of torture and excommunication, an almost commonplace ordeal in medieval justice that lacked protections we now take for granted. Extracting a confession from someone threatened with eternal damnation was hardly a challenge. Still, the evidence against him was exceptionally compelling. Over 100 witnesses testified concerning the disappearances, and even his own servants furnished meticulous accounts of the murders, detailing specific victims and methods used. The sheer volume of corroborating accounts makes a grand conspiracy virtually impossible to orchestrate. Furthermore, Gilles himself appeared to embrace his guilt with unsettling enthusiasm. During his confession, he provided grotesque details of his crimes that far surpassed what was necessary for legal proceedings, recounting his methods, motivations, and even his emotional responses during the murders. Whether he was genuinely confessing to horrific acts or engaging in a masterful deception remains an open question. Ultimately, the court found him guilty on all charges. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was hanged and subsequently burned at the stake in Nantes, watched by a crowd that included many of the families whose children he had so cruelly murdered. His last words, reportedly a prayer for forgiveness and a caveat to other young nobles about the perils of excess and vice, raise further questions of genuineness. Was this heartfelt remorse or the final act in a grotesque performance? The truth may likely remain lost to history. What we do know is that medieval France had just executed either its most notorious serial killer or the victim of grand political machinations. The truth, like so much of medieval history, perished with him. However, death was not the conclusion for Gilles de Rais. Rather, it marked the beginning of a nefarious transformation. For centuries following his execution, French authorities laboriously sought to erase him from the historical record. His name was removed from official accounts of Joan of Arc's campaigns, and historians chronicling the 100 Years' War frequently neglected to mention one of its most decorated commanders. The Church, embarrassed by its prolonged indifference to the community's missing children, feigned ignorance of Gilles' existence. But a story as compelling as his could not remain buried. By the 17th century, French storytellers began to integrate his heinous deeds into folktales. The wealthy nobleman who murdered children in his castle became the template for Charles Perrault's Blue Beard, a fairy tale about a rich man who kills his wives and hides their bodies behind a locked door. While the details were softened for children's narratives, the essence endured. Power coupled with secrecy yields horror. The psychological profile of Gilles de Rais emerged as a blueprint for fictional monsters that continue to haunt us. A charismatic leader concealing unspeakable darkness, a revered figure in society who preys on the vulnerable. a man who leverages wealth and position to commit his crimes. These archetypes resonate through storytelling history. Modern criminologists studying serial killers consistently recognize Gilles de Rais as one of the earliest documented cases of organized, ritualistic murder. His methods, including deliberate victim selection, escalating violence, and psychological manipulation, read like a textbook on criminal psychology penned 6 centuries before the field became established. What makes Gilles' legacy particularly disturbing is how it reflects the darker facets of medieval heroism. The very attributes that rendered him a remarkable knight, ruthlessness, a lack of empathy, and an unwavering belief in his own superiority, also sculpted him into an ideal predator. Medieval society effectively fostered the perfect conditions for his crimes, celebrating violence and empowering men who demonstrated the ability to wield it without restraint. The most chilling aspect of Gilles de Rais is not merely that he was a monster. Rather, it is that he epitomized a monster so seamlessly integrated into society that no one noticed until it was tragically too late. His journey from hero to villain was a slow descent, barely perceptible until it was far beyond recognition. Today, his story serves as a grim reminder that the distance between civilization and savagery is not as expansive as we might wish to believe. Every culture holds its own examples resembling Gilles de Rais, respected figures with chilling secrets safeguarded by power, wealth, and willful ignorance. The man who once stood proudly beside Joan of Arc has become a more enduring symbol than any saint, a permanent warning about the perils of affording unrestrained power to those unworthy of it. Gilles de Rais demonstrated that in the Middle Ages, one could die a hero and be resurrected as a monster. The most unnerving part is that he resembled a saint until the very moment he didn't. A cautionary lesson that the most dangerous predators often lurk not in the shadows but right beside the throne, adorned in medals and basking in applause. Whether Gilles de Rais was the first serial killer in history or merely a pawn entangled in the web of medieval politics, his harrowing tale compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and the fragile lines separating heroism from horror. Subscribe to Historic Horizon and hit the bell icon to explore more captivating stories from Europe's rich past. Like, share, and comment to support our journey and help us bring history to life for everyone.